Still on the aftermath of Election Day, a couple of folks have a story they want to tell. Welcome into my State of Mind. I am Dan York. It is always a pleasure to have you aboard. We're here each weeknight at 7:30. And don't forget, we repeat at 11:30. And if you don't see the show at 7:30 or 11:30 on any given night, and you're saying, oh, I missed York today, and I forgot to DVR or whatever, you go to WPRI.com and you can see the show right there at your leisure. Yeah, tonight we have a couple of folks who are Cianci supporters who feel like, you know, the hardball that Cianci's camp is noted for was really very much something that the other side this time around played ball with, meaning that it was pretty rough out there in the trenches. They want to tell their story, and I'm willing to listen, and I think you are too, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, let's check what we have. We got a big rundown tonight. That's kind of what it feels like when you're watching Washington. You know what I mean? I'll elaborate. Yeah, it was, despite all of the hoopla, and I have some random thoughts on that. You may as well. And you can respond at your state of mind. There is hope, though, because there's one little mechanism in the election season that we shall never see again as long as the legislature behaves itself. Yeah, because there was a no vote there. It looks like it's a slow death for Newport, unless. And the guy that's involved in that also gets a little commentary here as well. Mr. Paolino, Joe Paolino, has a role in both conversations, the one above it and the one right there. And then, of course, your state of mind is always interesting. So let's kick it in and let's talk about it nationally. By the way, Virginia, there is a whole nother world in the United States of America. And it's kind of like, you ever watch, well, how about Kansas City and San Francisco? You know, the Yankees weren't in, the Red Sox weren't in, the Mets weren't in, the Phillies weren't in. I mean, that World Series felt like it was a long way away, didn't it? Well, that's kind of how I feel about Washington and what the rest of the country did to send representation to it. I mean, right here, we're such a blue state. It's such a yawner when it comes to our congressional and Senate races, right? Jack Reed wins by 7 miles. Jim Langevin wins by 5 miles. David Cicilline wins by 4.5 miles. And it's never really a race. But guess what? The rest of the world, it's really a race. The president wasn't too happy. Back in 2012, he thought that the message sent when Congress was dominated by the Republicans, or won by the Republicans at least, was profound. This time around, he kind of slowed it down. I mean, but his face belies the whole thing. He said the Republicans had a good night. Mr. President, it's a lot more than a good night. It's a seismic shift and a message, and you can see on his face that he's not happy.
It's not to say that we won't disagree over some issues that we're passionate about. We will. Congress will pass some bills I cannot sign. I'm pretty sure I'll take some actions that some in Congress will not like. That's natural. That's how our democracy works. But we can surely find ways to work together on issues where there's broad agreement among the American people.
You like on what? License plates? I mean, what's he talking about? This whole thing comes down to Obamacare. The Republicans are going to have an interesting time. Take a look at the numbers here. This is a very significant numbers difference now. 52-43 in the Senate for the Republicans, 243 to 175 in the House of Representatives, and even the governors, of course, have no role in Washington specifically, 31 to 15. This was, wow, this is now the result. The Republicans now have a lot on their plate and may not have a lot of excuses other than that, which will be, hey, we sent bills. He already told you he can't sign the stuff that we want to do to wind down Obamacare and a whole bunch of other things, which will set them up for 2016 to say, okay, guys, just one more piece. If we could just get the Oval Office, we could fix this whole country. And then if they don't do it, it'll be the end of them. And the cycles continue. Next item. Yeah, it was here. Headline. And then inside the story, we see that in 2012, 45% of the general election crowd turned out, and in 2010, less. Now, here's the thing. 2012 was a general election, and the presidency generally excites people by 5% at least. This is not an embarrassing voter turnout, but I will tell you, for the most part, I've never been one who argues that you got to get out to vote just to get out to vote. You know, I've always felt that quality is more important than quantity, and I'll stick to that. The thing is, though, we have to admit that it was uninspiring in a lot of ways. And the negative advertising really does beat down a lot of people and their choice to go vote. I don't know what we're ever going to do about that, because the First Amendment is there for the taking, and the super PAC money is there for the abusing. But chin up. There will always be another election for you to engage in if you didn't engage in this one. And Gina Raimondo has a chance to inspire, even though she was one of the two that didn't. Bob Healy kind of inspired. He will be here tomorrow night, but I got my own tough questions for Bob Healy, who may have just had a lightning in the bottle moment, you know what I mean? But there is hope, as I say, because next time around, we won't have the master lever to kick around anymore. Here's some of the data on the master lever. Democrats, 33,000 statewide, almost 34,000. Republicans, 11,000, and moderates even 7,000. I didn't even know there was 7,000 moderates in Rhode Island. That's a big phone booth for them. Congratulations. I don't know what their party really means or what it's about, and Bob Healy was the guy for it, but he was just renting the party, so I don't know. But here's the thing, it's all over. Legislation ends the one line to draw come 2016, which will have a very, very serious impact on races like the city of Providence specifically. Did we put that number up? Here's the Providence number. Yeah, so you think Buddy Cianci had an uphill climb with the media and with the East Side? Look at the overall master lever actions by the voters in the city of Providence. He running as an independent against Jorge Elorza, the Democrat. That's a pretty tough number to overcome, something he knew and had to calculate but couldn't overcome. That all goes away in 2016, which gives a little bit of an enema, a flush to our election cycle, which will be good for everybody, which means if you're a staunch Democrat or Republican or moderate, you'll have to draw 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines. So get your elbow loose. All right, next item. Newport, not so grand. When the voters in Newport say, you know what, the heck with you, even though the statewide voters said, sure, put table games down there, it presents a little bit of a situation. Joe Paolino caused a headline today as he's been talking about his remaining interest in Newport Grand. He had said, I'm not investing any money there, huffing and puffing, you know, unless I get table games. The table games were the essential part of that casino vote. I mean, they're still gambling down there as we speak, right now as you're watching in Newport Grand. A lesser and lesser amount, of course. Now Paolino's saying, well, there might be room for discussion about this. The only room for discussion is going to be a little bit of shake and bake at the State House, because the only way that anybody's going to invest in that is to get a bigger take, even a bigger take than what comes at Twin River, and the city of Newport will get a lesser take. The state's going to have to give up, well, I don't know, you know, actually, let me think that. I don't know about how Newport's going to fare, but we as taxpayers will have to take a lesser bunch of money from Newport for anybody to invest in that. So stay tuned, because that's going to be a slow death one way or the other, with the Massachusetts gaming thumbs up by the petition drive failing to stop gaming in Massachusetts. So it's only a matter of time before Newport Grand is a parking lot anyway, or some other economic development project. And speaking of Joe Paolino, actually Joe had something to say about the gaming, didn't he? We'll skip that because I'm going to play him here anyway. Joe was on the radio today, and he, being a staunch ally and chief spokesman for Buddy Cianci, at least cheerleader to get him into the race, had this to say about the Providence Journal's behavior in this election.
He took an onslaught from everybody. Have you ever seen a newspaper go so aggressively against a person in a campaign? I mean, quite frankly, if he ever wanted to sit down with lawyers and talk about the aggressiveness, I think he could probably have a case. I've never seen anything like that.
He's talking about this. Look at these headlines, you know, back to 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 back, all day, every day, it felt like, from the Providence Journal. But Joe, stop it, please. I'm hoping that you're smart enough to know that there's absolutely no legal action that Buddy Cianci could take against the Providence Journal for articulating its point of view over and over and over again. That's a market-driven, high-risk behavior on their part. Hell, if Cianci had won, they would be irrelevant almost, right? But Cianci didn't, and so they hang on to the relevance. The sour taste in your mouth and everybody else's mouth who supports Cianci about the Journal's behavior will reflect in the market's reaction and consumer habits. but you don't have to. You can't sue them. There's no merit to that, and you should know that, Joe. All right, let's check out your state of mind and see what's going on here. You know, this is how you get in touch with us. 228-1886 is the number. stateofmind@myritv.com is the email. Here's a voicemail from one of our listeners.
You would think the police, the fire, and the teachers would have to take P-tests like the state and the city workers do. But since they don't make them do it, the government's always going to be a sham.
We played that because Jess thinks it's funny. I was trying P-tests, and she finally said P, like P? Yeah, I think they do, don't they? But maybe the Central Coventry Fire District Chief didn't. Clearly, it wasn't up to date based on the Target 12 investigation that has him suspended with pay right now. Stay tuned. I'll have to check to see who has to take the P test and who doesn't. Interesting supporters of Cianci with a story coming up next. Stay with us.
I have enjoyed sharing my vision, our vision of one Providence. One Providence. It's my firm belief that we can only get there with honest leadership, with openness, transparency, and ethics at City Hall.
You know, I always get pretty interested in the conversation about ethics, transparency, honesty, good behavior, because if you think that there's always a sinless soul in an election, then you're sadly mistaken. Of course, I don't need to remind you about the election results in the city of Providence. Do I? Jorge Alorza beating Buddy Cianci 53-44. While Cianci held his own for most of the city, the east side absolutely crushed him, and that's where a lot of the influence in this race came down. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to invite people to the show to talk about the race from a supporter point of view on both sides. You know, Alorza supporters are absolutely welcome here, and I want everyone to have a free and open conversation. But I ran into Leah Williams-Metz at the Cianci party headquarters on election night, and nice to see you, dear.
Thank you so much for having me back.
You may have met Leah on this show when she was advocating so hard for the Davy Lopes pool, and James Montero is a guy I'm just meeting who's got a heck of a story in and of itself. Why is my phone ringing? My goodness. You know, I should have turned it off. It's actually my daughter. You don't mind if I take a phone call here, do you?
You gotta answer it.
Oh my God. Interesting stuff. So welcome.
Thank you.
You stopped being, you did a provocative thing. You thought supporting Buddy Cianci was kind of a reach out for you. And I think a lot of people went, what? Right?
Yes.
Why, first of all, why did a lot of people say, what? Why were people surprised? As a community organizer, as you're known to be.
I believe most people were surprised because I was supporting Smiley, and he dropped, and then I had to make another decision because I am going to stay in politics because what happened to the Davy Lopes pool. And you have to stay involved in order for, you know, things to get done in your community for the better of the children and the people that
That's
are in
why
it.
he was provocative, because you were a Smiley supporter. And so when he melded, you jumped ship.
Well, you know, I took a few weeks and I made a decision. I sat down, because this was before the primary, and I sat down with Solomon, and I sat down with Jorge, and I sat down with Cianci, and I decided that Cianci was the best person, that had the most experience in the vision outside of Smiley. You know, I really did believe in Smiley, but unfortunately he dropped, so I had to make another decision.
Okay, hold your thought. And you were a supporter for Cianci. Why?
I was a supporter for Cianci because I believed he had the best vision for the city as a whole.
You work with youth
Yes.
in the city. You've got quite a story. I'd like you to come back someday and talk about your story, because you got
No
jammed
problem.
up. You were in jail for a pretty tough crime for 10 years, correct?
Yes, in
and
Baltimore.
You've turned your life around.
Oh, definitely.
You're a
Yeah.
contributor to society right now. You see things differently.
Yes.
Why did you support Cianci?
I supported Cianci because I believe he had the best vision for the city. I also believe he's more connected with the issues in the city.
Meaning?
He's more visible. He's more accessible. Alorza, I didn't know. I met Alorza briefly, but I don't see him as much. And
Right, so you
Cianci-
felt a disconnect with Alorza a little bit?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting. You know what? I'm going to leave it here, and then I'm going to come back, and then I want to talk a little bit about the trouble, because you felt like you got a lot of aggravation
Oh,
for
there was-
exercising your First Amendment rights. Yes?
Yes, I got a lot of hate mail. I
All right,
got
we'll
people
talk-
attacking me.
We'll talk about what that was like
Mm-hmm.
when we come back. Stay with us.
I can tell you that it was a great experience. And it was a great, great love affair that I have with the city of Providence that will never end, that will continue till the day I die.
One thing about Buddy Cianci is that he loves this city, and no one can deny that. And I thanked him for his efforts. It was a hard-fought campaign, but he was very gracious in defeat.
You know, I said this to Ted last night. If you missed last night's show, Ted Nisi and I were talking about the election. I crack up over what happens after elections are over. Because if Jorge Elorza had once said, you know what, in a debate or something like that, a public forum, let me just admit something. I know Buddy Cianci loves this city. This election might have turned on a dime. You know, that rhetoric is easy after an election, don't you think, James?
Yeah.
Kind of, right?
Yeah.
So I first saw James at a press conference when Buddy Cianci was talking about his police concepts. And Leah and I have known each other since the Davy Lopes Pool situation. We don't have a lot. I'm going to have James back because he's got a great story. But I want to hear a little bit about his political perspective in the segment. But you were so stressed on election night, not because the race was so tight, but you felt like you got manhandled in this season. So tell me about that.
Yes, you know, as a single mom of 4, I actually had people calling my job and putting pressure. You know, I don't know if they were trying to get me fired or just, you know, just putting pressure. They were calling different organizations that I'm involved in to try to get me to be kicked off boards.
And you don't feel comfortable naming names, but tell me about the kinds of people we're talking about. Are these organized people in the Elorza campaign or in the
They are
anybody but
supporters.
Cianci group? Or
They are supporters of Elorza, and you know, there are some people that are, you know, the 1%, I should say. Yeah, so I definitely don't want to name names, although I could. Yet. But
well, listen, you're going to keep people on the edge of the couch and going to say, well, if you can't name names, what are you doing on Dan's show? Why don't we do this? Because it's just a couple days after the election. Tell me the rest of it, what you think, and I'll let you tell me who you think they are, because I don't know who they are, and then I'll give them a chance to come here and talk about it. But I think you should come back and tell me what was going on, because people don't really understand the rough and tumble that goes on with people who put their own necks out. You decided you wanted to support Cianci, that was your call, but you feel like you paid a price well past what you should have paid, correct?
Definitely.
Your job was threatened.
Yes.
Your psyche damaged by it?
A little, but I'm tough.
Do you think that you have something now to pay back for in this whole thing? Had he won, would you have, tell me, I mean, what
do you mean as far?
What were you worried about? I mean, it gets rough and tumble for everybody out there. What were you really concerned about?
As far as the attacks and the hate mail?
Yes, all this.
I was afraid, really. I was afraid. I was afraid for, you know, I'm a single mom. You know, I have 4 children. I was afraid that someone was going to barrage me on the street, or, you know, I had my car written on. My car was written on. Kevin Jackson's car was vandalized twice.
The councilman.
The councilman, Kevin Jackson, his car was vandalized twice.
Who did win, by the way?
He did win.
He did win.
Thanks. Oh. Yes, thank you.
You're happy about that?
I'm extremely happy.
He's your
about
councilman.
Yes.
Definitely.
Why are you happy about that?
Grew up with Kevin. Kevin has been there since day one. He was a lot of our track coach, and just the whole basis behind the challenger for the council, his challenger, it was wrong. It was wrong.
All right. Well, that's a race that we can analyze. Did you see the same kind of on the street political warfare that Leah did in your support for Buddy Cianci?
I seen strategy that was coming from very high places.
Like, explain.
Very high places.
Just stuff that, just like some of the news media, some of the advertising. This is another big problem that I had with, this is another reason that made me want to support Cianci more. Because something's going on behind the scenes in this whole race that was beyond, in my opinion, Elorza. And I think Elorza ran a wonderful campaign. I think he's a strong person. I think he did a wonderful job. But to get a mayoral, a presidential endorsement, that didn't come from Elorza.
Right. Well, listen, let's not kid ourselves. I mean, Mirth York spent some money on in what was a fledgling anybody but Cianci campaign. The strategies when Lauren Adrian got out, Brett Smiley got out, you know, Solomon and his support. I mean, there was a strong feeling that the city would go up in flames if Buddy Cianci became the mayor. You, who see so many criminal things daily on the street and have talked about it, didn't feel that way at all.
No.
Oh well. At some juncture, I want you to come back and talk about the conditions in the city, because that's important. People are watching this and trying to, what's the moral of the story? What are you trying to say about what was going on in this race?
It was just a very negative, campaign tactic that the other, and I'm not going to say it was all Elorza's team, because I know they were super PACs, made that were, not necessarily on his team. They were for him, but not necessarily on his team. And let me go on to say that I do love Jorge as well. I grew up in Jorge. We grew up 2 doors down from each other. It wasn't anything personal for me to endorse Cianci. I just believed in Cianci's vision and his passion, and I'm raising 4 children right now, and I believe that Cianci would have went into office and gotten things done that day. That day that he walked in, he would have got something done. I feel that, with more, if you don't have the experience, then you have to, maybe take a year or 2 to gain that experience.
Well, that's not going to happen. But the moral of the story in terms of fair fighting and sportsmanship, what is it? That those who look like they're doing God's work may not necessarily be doing it on the ground?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, well, at some juncture, you have to come a little bit clearer with this. I'm sure the viewers would like to hear that story. And you've got to come back and talk about what's going on at your side of the city, all right? Thanks for stopping in.
Thank you so much
Your
for
state
having
of
us.
mind? Actually, one more thought when we come back. Stay with us. I will tell you that I think that conversation that we just had may leave you wanting. I'm not big on hedging bets. If you got something to say, you got something to say. But Leah Williams-Metz, who was here in the last segment and the last 2 segments, really is very worried, legitimately, about her gig and her quality of life in the city. And at some juncture, she may talk about who it is that really kind of psychologically muscled her or actually threatened her employment. If she's going public with that at some juncture, we will follow up with that person and ask them to kind of commiserate about it. But just know, the moral of the story here is that there's no purity on either side of a political election. It is hard ball in the streets, no doubt. All righty, we'll see you tomorrow. Bob Healy will be my guest, and I'll talk to you on the radio at noontime tomorrow on WPRO.